Mariana, Mariana said I've been working on this. In fact, I've been thinking about it my whole life. I attended at Sherwood Elementary School an all-white kindergarten, and then desegregation occurred in first grade. And by the time I was in high school, 40% of my classmates were African Americans from this community, many of whom were descendants of people who had been enslaved in this community by my ancestors. So it's been a matter of a personal biography to think about this in general. And I'm not a historian. I'm not really an expert on this topic, but I really believe that there is an important story. Some of it's a shameful conduct, morally repugnant conduct on the part of our white ancestors. But I think the story needs to be explored and understood and told with fresh interpretation and fresh eyes, and certainly as part of our local understanding of what it might mean to repair the harms that were done that continue to have echoes into the present. In that spirit, I'll share some of what I have for us this evening. The practice of enslaving laborers to work on farms in our area began with the arrival of the first settlers of European descent, who brought with them slaves and staffed up the labor supply. And the first economic product of significant economic value beyond subsistence farming was tobacco. Tobacco for 60 or 100 years was the mainstay of our local economy, and the beautiful meeting house built in 1817 was made possible by the financial contributions of members of this community who had become wealthy through tobacco culture and through enslavement. So let's begin. And this is not there will be times when in the presentation, and certainly after the presentation, when we will continue to uh, reflect on the conduct of our forebears and an effort to understand our responsibilities today. Um, the first families of Sandy Spring and their plantations. We called them farms, but really these were tobacco plantations. Charlie Forrest is the first, 1728. The Charlie Forrest house was constructed in 1728. Almost all of the historic record says that Charlie Forrest was built by James Brooke, but we know that Charlie Forrest would have been built by the enslaved workers of James Brooke. Um, James Brooke and Deborah Snowden married in 1725. James Brooke arrived here. He had sold his property. He's 21 years old. He sold his property. Let's see, 1705. He was 23 years old when he arrived, just 20 years old when he married, and he had property in southern Maryland that he inherited from his father. And he sold that property and invested in a piece of a land grant here in Sandy Spring, amounted to just over 1,000 acres. But during his lifetime, his land holdings here in Montgomery County expanded to 20,000, or even in one reference, 33,000 acres. That's wealth. He didn't build a magnificent mansion. He added to his land holdings, and we'll see later, he never manumitted his slaves. He was read out of the Sandy Spring Monthly Meeting. Our first settler refused to free his enslaved workers. The second family arriving a year later, John Thomas and Elizabeth Snowden. Now, remember, it was James Brooke and Deborah Snowden. Well, Elizabeth Snowden is her sister, and John Thomas is her husband, and they come and establish a plantation at Cherry Grove. They also have a land grant of 1,000 acres, which grows during their life there to be perhaps as much as 10,000 acres. That the land grant is called Snowden's Manor, and the addition to Snowden's Manor, manor amounting to over 10,000 acres. And of course, we'll discuss in a little bit who this magnificently wealthy father of Deborah and Elizabeth was, Richard Snowden. lived in the area of Laurel and operated an iron mine and an iron foundry there. The third family that we want to address at this time is Samuel Thomas Jr. and Mary Snowden. Mary is the sister of those other two Snowden girls, and Samuel Thomas Jr. is the brother of John Thomas, who came to Cherry Grove. So at the very beginning, Sandy Spring is made up of six young Quakers, three young Quaker couples who come with their enslaved workers to establish very successful plantations carved out of the wilderness through the work and the labor of the enslaved workers. Notice that in these three households, there are three sisters, are the wives, and two brothers are the husbands in two of them. But actually, in the third, James Brooke, who seems not to quite, he's not a brother of Samuel Thomas and John Thomas, but he actually has lived for the last 5 years, and before his marriage of his teenage years, he lived with Richard Snowden, the father of the three girls, because he was alienated from his own household when his father died when he was young, and his mother remarried in only a couple of years, and his stepfather was cruel to him. And under an order of the court, he was removed from that household. He retained his rights to inheritance of property in Southern Maryland. And he was placed under a guardianship with Richard Snowden, the father of the three girls. So this creates a lot of genealogical difficulties and cross currents, not the least of which is because Richard Snowden lost his first wife, who was Elizabeth Cole, Coale. And I mentioned Samuel Thomas Jr. and Mary Snowden established a plantation of over 1,000 acres in what today is called Colesville. And I believe the name Colesville comes from the maiden name of Richard Snowden's first wife, but I've never read that anywhere. It just seems to make sense to me. And there have been times, her name was spelled Coale. There were times early when Colesville was spelled Coalesville. So in any case, these three families begin plantation life and Quaker meeting together in one another's homes on this frontier settlement where the tobacco plantations are carved from the wilderness. Now, I want to take a step back because I know that Pat Powers will be speaking about the relationship between Sandy Spring Meeting and Indigenous Americans next Sunday night, but she may not go back to, there was a lot of activity on the part of Sandy Spring Quakers in the 19th century supporting efforts to improve the conditions for the Western Indians in the Western United States. Quakers in Sandy Spring were on committees and did important work, sometimes on behalf of the government during the times when the government was behaving better toward the Native Americans. But in any case, we go all the way back to the first occupancy of the East Coast of the United States by ancient Native population. And this Brookville Spear Point is it was found in a creek in Brookville by Mish Bose, a member of our meeting. And it's 4 inches long, and it's from a material that's only available in the Catoctin Mountains. And it was dated by an anthropologist at 5200 BC. I've learned in recent years that arrowheads are a relatively newer technological development, that spears were used to hunt for animals, and the bow and arrow perhaps was developed 1,000 or 2,000 years ago, but the spears go back tens of thousands of years in human hunting. These arrowheads were found at Willow Grove, which is one of the historic homes off of Bachelor's Forest Road. Every farm here had arrowheads, and we need to understand that the settlements of the native population upon the arrival of Europeans were along the rivers, the Patuxent River, most likely in our area. But the highlands up where we are would have been hunting grounds. And so with thousands of years of hunting with bows and arrows, there would be an accumulation of arrowheads. 1,000 years is a long time for people to be hunting in one area, and it only takes an occasional loss of an arrowhead for them to build up over that period of a millennium. So, in fact, all the fields had arrowheads here, and some more than others. This is a soapstone bowl in the collection. By the way, those arrowheads are in the collection of Sandy Spring Museum. This soapstone bowl is in the collection, these two bowls, the collection at Sandy Spring Museum. What is a soapstone bowl? Well, soapstone, first of all, is a mineral that is relatively soft, and it can be carved with, stone, other harder stone tools. And so the native population used these bowls. This larger bowl probably weighs 20, 25 pounds. And that could be put in a bed of coals, and a stew or soup could be made there. A hot rock could be put into a stew in the soapstone bowl. And you should know that there's a soapstone quarry of ancient, vintage on Ednor Road. And the Montgomery County Park Service has bought the property, 34-acre property, and is turning that soapstone quarry into a historic site. I mean, a site for educational purposes and for people to basically learn about the early American native use of this particular stone in there for a household implement. Now, one of the things that these stones convince us is the fact that this is not a nomadic population. These are not wandering hunters. These are people who are settling in villages, because you don't carry a 25-pound stone around as a cooking pot. The agriculture of the Eastern Woodland Indians, according to anthropologists, began with early domestication of indigenous plants approximately 2,000 years ago. Conversion to maize agriculture. This would be the Three Sisters gardening practice, corn, beans, and squash. Beginning about 1,000 years ago, that reached here, having moved, century by century up from Central America. And then we know there were then, with agriculture happening and the Three Sisters gardening activities, permanent settlements with clearings of cultivated crops, generally near rivers. Rivers were the best transportation method for the native population. This is a map made by Captain John Smith of Jamestown in a very early exploration that he did of the Chesapeake Bay and its tributaries. Actually, the north is to the right on this image. I think the X is Washington, D.C. And the river that arches across the top is the Potomac, okay, with north on the right. And then the Patuxent is the river that arches through the middle. And notice that what he's named here are the native tribes. This land is occupied, is the point of this map, upon the first arrival of European settlers. Now, this is a watercolor done in 1586. This is more than 20 years before Jamestown. British explorers are traveling up and down, sailing up and down the East Coast, and one man, a Britisher who was documenting the native villages that they saw, made this watercolor sketch, which is probably our best rendering of what a village would have looked at that time, essentially before European contact. Now, we think of in our history books in school, we hear how Jamestown was the important beginning. It was just the beginning of English settlement, permanent settlement in the New World. St. Augustine was earlier. Massachusetts Bay was a little later. And St. Mary's, Maryland, 1634 was the arrival of the Ark and the Dove, the two ships that the Lords Baltimore, the Calverts, arranged to bring settlers to their new colony that they received through the generosity of King Charles I. Now, I think it's important to read because it really, you may think we've deviated from the topic of enslavement here, but in fact, the whole nature of the deeding of land to the Calverts by the king sort of helps to set up some of the arrogance that underlies the whole phenomenon of transatlantic chattel slavery. Charles writes, and by the way, Charles is married in 1625, Henrietta Maria of Spain, Maryland is named after her in honor of his generous gift to the Lords Baltimore. Whereas our well-beloved subject, Cecilius Calvert, Baltimore, being animated with a laudable zeal for religion and also the territories of our empire, hath humbly besought leave of us that he may transport by his own industry and expense a numerous colony of the English nation to a certain region in a country hitherto uncultivated, in the parts of America and partly occupied by savages having no knowledge of the divine being, and that all that region may by our royal highness be given, granted, and committed unto him and his heirs. So that's a charter of 1632, and it took a couple of years for them to get here. But just to realizing that the Ark of the Dove arrived in 1634 under this charter to the Lords Baltimore. And Robert Brooke, who's an ancestor of James Brooke, our first Sandy Spring settler, arrived in 1650. So it's his grandson, or his great-grandson, who is the first settler in Sandy Spring. He arrives with his spouse, 10 children, and 28 servants, and a pack of hounds that became actually quite well known across America among fox hunting people. It turns out that the Lords Baltimore between 1652 and 1680 arranged for anyone bringing people to their new colony would get 50 acres per person. So by bringing 39 people, Robert Brooke received immediately upon arrival a land grant of significant amount of acreage. Now, again, this is under the mindset that the king can give all this land to whomever he wishes because it's not occupied, it's not cultivated, and there are only savages who have no knowledge of the divine being living here. Richard Snowden, this is grandfather of the Richard Snowden who's the father of the three girls, arrives in Maryland in 1658. Philip Thomas, who's the grandfather of the John Thomas, Samuel Thomas, he arrives in 1651. So these are very early Maryland settlers from England who have come and actually have established a good deal of wealth. I mean, their grandchildren are wealthy when they come to the Sandy Spring area to set up these plantations. What's happening in southern Maryland is that the growth of tobacco, generation after generation, has exhausted the soil. So new soils are needed to successfully grow tobacco, and these plantations and their broad extent are an extremely valuable new asset for these families. Tobacco requires clearing the forest because, as you know, this whole area was continuous forest all the way to the Mississippi River. The tobacco would be packed into hogsheads. This is extremely laborious. The harvest, the packing of this, someone's got to make these hogsheads. The hogsheads are rolled on a rolling road. The roads from here to the Elk Ridge Landing to Bladensburg and to Georgetown were primitive roads, very difficult for a carriage to negotiate. But oxen would be used to haul these large casks of tobacco weighing up to a ton to port. Now, why the cask like this? It seems like a strange way to package the tobacco. This is to prevent pilferage. This cask gets all the way to London or to Liverpool before it's opened by a crew of men at the tobacco shop with tools. And if the cask were opened anywhere along the way by a sailor, for example, pilfering tobacco, it would become quite evident. And so that the hogshead was like the shipping container of its day. Now, here we have, did Sandy Spring plantation owners participate in this trade? We have the bills right here. I donated these to the Sandy Spring Museum. This is Mr. James Brooke, his account current with James Russell of London. And this is for 4 hogsheads of tobacco, $9.55. Now, I don't know what that 9.55 pounds, I guess 4 hogsheads of tobacco. The date is 1768. James Brooke is, of course, our first settler. And now his plantation is well established. And of course, he's adding to his lands with the proceeds because the enslaved workers have allowed him to become wealthy in land. This is actually his son. This is a sale that occurred about a decade earlier. His son is Roger Brooke IV. who has established a plantation at Brook Grove, which is across the creek from Charlie Forrest. Brook Grove's on the property of the current Brook Grove nursing home. And this has a lot of detail on this bill, which shows the charge for cooperage, which is putting the tobacco into a hogshead, for porterage and wharfage and lighterage. Lighterage is taking the hogshead off of a big boat that can't quite make it to shore in of the Thames and putting in a smaller boat that can bring it ashore to the dock. And so there's small fees along the way. And this is London, 1754. This is an actual bill. I'd love to talk to a real, historical economist who could sort out what all these notes mean. Notice that it makes the point that these hogsheads were received of the Snowden James Elaine. This is a ship from Mary Dot. So Maryland is abbreviated. Does James Snowden have a ship? Well, yes, he does have a ship. He's known as the Iron Master of Maryland. He has an iron mine down on the Patuxent River near present-day Laurel. He owns all of the land, which is today Laurel, and much of the land extending from Laurel out to today's Spencerville, Ashton, and Sandy Spring. This is all part of Snowden's Manor, and Snowden's Manor enlarged, these large land grants from the Lords Baltimore. He was known as the Iron Master of Maryland. He became very wealthy as an iron miner and forger. He used enslaved people in his iron forge and mine. In the 1690s, he pushed the Maryland Assembly to establish the Maryland Rangers to manage hostilities with Native Americans. Some historians believe that he arranged to have the Native Americans pushed out of this land between the Patuxent and the Patapsco. That's the land where we reside. It's been reported that by 1698, there was no longer an Indian presence along the Patuxent. He advertised in 1729 the arrival of his ship in South River with 200 choice slaves. So he is an enslaver. He's a trafficker in human beings. He's brought them from Africa to his iron operation, and he probably has made a gift to his sons-in-law and daughters to staff the new plantations on the frontier in Sandy Spring. George Fox made a visit to Maryland in 1672, 1673. He was really on the east coast of the United States for a year. He used Maryland as kind of a base of operation. And many Marylanders converted to Quakerism, including the ancestors of those Thomases and those Snowdens who came. The Brooks were Catholics. James Brooke converted to Quakerism only after he became a guardian in the home of Richard Snowden, who was a Quaker, the Quaker enslaver and human trafficker. The history of American Quakerism, the history of American Quaker opposition to slavery goes back to 1688 when Germantown Meeting of Friends created the first public protest against slavery in the American colonies. This is actually an important date and an important event for historians of the history of enslavement in the New World. It was the first time a group of white people said, this is wrong. And they wrote that down and they sent it to everyone in the Quaker community. It was a long time before American Friends took up this issue. In 1754, Philadelphia Yearly Meeting of Friends approved a letter opposing slavery. In 1768, Baltimore Yearly Meeting approved a declaration against slavery. In 1779, the meeting established a committee to visit with friends who were in the practice of keeping slaves. That's a quote. And then in 1781, the first disownments occurred in Sandy Spring of friends who refused to free their slaves. And who was the first disowned? James Brooke, our very first settler, our founder, in a way. He refused. He was, there were friends from Philadelphia who came to labor with Sandy Spring Quaker slaveholders. And they met with him and they came back and reported the meeting. He was obstinate in his refusal. There were efforts by friends in the 19th century to end the practice of slavery in the 18th and 19th centuries. This is the Holy Bible that I now own. The Bible, Family Bible of Robert H. Miller. Robert H. Miller is an ancestor of mine, but also of Marianne Garrison, the Millers of Sandy Spring. Robert H. Miller had 11 children, and 5 of them came and married into these Quaker families in Sandy Spring. So all of us who are descended from the Brooks and the Millers and the Thomases share in this question about the conduct of our ancestors in relationship to slavery. Robert Miller purchased some slaves in Alexandria for the purpose of freeing them. That was a practice that some Quakers who had the wealth would engage in. In fact, some of the Quakers that were made, were freed as a result of Robert H. Miller's purchase of them, came, into some prominence in the free black community in Virginia. Robert H. Miller was a dealer in fine china from England. Had a big shop in Alexandria, another shop in St. Louis. So in the late 18th century, the Friends in Sandy Spring are beginning to unwind this practice of slaveholding. James Brooke never freed his slaves. He was disowned. I don't have the date there. I think it was 81. James Brooke Jr. freed his son freed enslaved workers by 1760. Roger Brooke IV, another son, inherited a fourth of the enslaved workers, and actually died soon after. And his son, Roger Brooke V, my great grandfather, inherited his father's slaves, and they were freed soon after, because enormous pressure at this point for Quakers to free their slaves. Richard Thomas, one of the largest slaveholders in Maryland, manumitted over 100 slaves in his will in 1806 or 1807, but 44 were underaged or elderly, and we'll see that that's an issue. Samuel Snowden manumitted 84 people at one time in 1787. Major Richard Brooke is another son of our first settler, James. He never freed his slaves, and he was read out of the meeting. He also was active in the Revolutionary War, joining the army, and was read out of the meeting for his taking an oath of allegiance to the state of Maryland during the colony of Maryland during the Revolutionary War. Under Maryland law, males beneath the age of 20 and females under 18 would receive freedom only when they came of age. It was illegal to free the enslaved elderly over 45 years of age. So when Richard Thomas died under his will, over 100 enslaved were freed, but 44 were underage or elderly. And they lived with members of the Quaker community in Brookville until they came of age or until they passed away. So in fact, we like to think of slavery among Friends in Sandy Spring having ended by 1800, but in fact, that's not the case. There were these late manumissions, like, for example, Richard Thomas, but also then the tail end as the young enslaved and as the elderly remain in bondage in these households until they came of age or pass away. This is my friend, Charles Thomas Jr. and his daughter, Natalie Thomas Williams. They're standing at the fireplace at Cherry Grove. Cherry Grove, again, we saw earlier, built in 1729 by John Thomas and Elizabeth Snowden, or by their enslaved workers. And this fireplace made of bricks from the local, land there on the farm, would have been built at that time. Now, that house, which was a log structure, burned down in 1772 and was rebuilt. The entire house was rebuilt in brick. It's a very substantial historic brick home here now. But this fireplace survives and is probably the only remaining piece of architecture from the very origins of Sandy Spring in the 1720s. When I arranged a visit for the Thomases to come and have a tour of Cherry Grove, as we were about to leave, Charles Thomas Jr. said to me, "Tom, would you come take a picture of me in the kitchen where my ancestors would have worked?" It is a reminder that we have this opportunity in Sandy Spring to be working together as the descendants of enslavers and the descendants of the enslaved, to try to figure out where we go from here. This 1810 barn in Ashton has a big stone. I use this barn in my farming operation. I don't own any farmland, but I lease some property over here behind me in Ashton. And this barn has a cornerstone with engraving 1810. Actually, the engraving is in soapstone because that can be easily engraved. It's a beautiful engraving. 1810, and it's engraved with the initials of Bernard Gilpin. Of course, I had thought 1810, that's after the period of enslavement, but in fact, Sarah Thomas is a daughter of Richard Thomas, who freed his slaves under his will. And probably this barn would have, there would have been some assistance in the barn by enslaved people who were over the age of 45 or under the age of 20, the men. This is a part of a record, a ledger made by Roger Brooke V, my great-great-grandfather. And the year is 1800, and he's selling beef on this ledger. This is all available on Digital Maryland through an arrangement the Sandy Spring Museum made with Digital Maryland to post these documents, but thousands, tens of thousands of documents online. This is a sale of beef on this ledger. Beef is being sold for 6.25 cents a pound, 84 pounds to someone up there, 6.25 cents, 76 pounds, 6.25 cents. But Jeremiah Thomas, a black man, gets his beef at 6 cents a pound. I don't know what all that means, but I did, using a figure that Coleman Bazelon gave me of 2.5% per year. I figured that maybe we can think of 6 cents a pound being roughly $8 a pound for beef, which is about what beef goes for today at the Safeway. This is the post-slavery period. You have some successful black farmers. Charles Hill purchased a 150-acre farm in 1902. He was a very prominent citizen in this community, hosted black horse shows that attracted black farmers from all across Maryland. This is the census of the Berry District, the 1850 census. It's the U.S. federal census. William Henry Farquhar is the census taker, you can see up here. And he lists his family first on this. Every individual is listed and named, but not the enslaved. This is only for free inhabitants in the Berry District for 1850. He lists himself as a surveyor. Of course, we know he was an educator. Only 10 years later, he was appointed as the first commissioner of Montgomery County Public Schools. That's why there's a public school named after William Henry Farquhar here in the neighborhood. He was born in Pennsylvania, York, Pennsylvania, and he married Margaret Farquhar, who was a daughter of Amos Farquhar, who was our first Farquhar settler, 1820s, in Sandy Spring area. The Farquhars came down to be part of the new Baltimore yearly meeting Quaker boarding school, Fair Hill. Fair Hill later became the home of Richard Brooke, who was read out for joining in the Revolutionary War and for keeping slaves. There's so much information. I could pour over these census lists for hours. Here's Remus Hill, shingle maker, a black man, and a very 34 years old, very skilled. Remus Hill appears in lots of documents at the Sandy Spring Museum because his name appears in the ledgers where he's paid for his work in construction of some of these marvelous homes owned by Quakers. His pay rate was $1.25 per day. And he was obviously a free black man doing this work in the 1850s. In this household, Roger Brooke, this is Roger Brooke VI of Willow Grove. The Brooke children are listed here. He's 39 years old. His wife, Sally Brooke, 35. These are the children. And then we have some laborers in the household. And two of them are from Ireland. These are white laborers from Ireland, and then two of them are black. John Foreman and Thomas Russell, black laborers. This is the 1850, so this is before emancipation in the United States, before the Civil War. But white and black workers living together in this household. There are all kinds of sort of family stories that one sees with these, census records. I want to just stop there and thank you all for your patience and apologize for my technical glitch in the middle, but also eager to join in a conversation with the participants on this Zoom meeting.
Thanks for watching our video. For more content from Sandy Spring Friends Meeting, click to subscribe.